Okay, Mr. Chair, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and welcome to the November 9th, 2020 special meeting of the Public Works Advisory Board. This is being held via teleconference. We have a quorum. At this time, only member Doug Rogers is not present. All of the other members are. Let's see. If there's any members of the public that would like to speak on the agenda items, now is the time to do that. If you are on the computer, you would press the, or on the Zoom meeting, you would press the raise hand button. If you're on the telephone, then you would press *9 in order to raise your hand. We'll give it a minute or so for people to make those entries. And Zeke will let us know if anybody is in the queue.
Yes, sir. Somebody just showed up in the queue and raised their hand when you said that. The number ending in 128.
Okay, go ahead, speaker.
Okay. And speaker, you are live. You just need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Hi, it's Doug Rogers. Hello, everybody.
Okay, so Doug is now present. Are you able to elevate him, Zeke, to the meeting?
No, sir, because he's on the telephone. I can't move him over.
Okay.
That's okay. I'm here. I'll listen.
So whenever he raises his hand, you'll...
Well, I'll just keep them open unless it's interfering with it, and then I'll do that.
Okay, if there are no other members of the public in the queue for public participation, we'll close public comment at this time.
No, sir, no other members or no other public in the queue.
All right, thank you. The first item on the agenda for the special meeting is the minutes of August 19th, 2020. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes of August 19th? If there are none, would someone move for approval?
I move to approve the minutes of the 19th.
Okay, it's been moved by Tori. Is there a second?
I will second it.
And Jan has seconded it. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those
Aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The motion carries. The next item is the approval of the minutes of September 16th, 2020. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes as presented? Seeing none, then is there a motion to approve as submitted?
I'll move. Okay.
It's been moved by John, and Jan, do you second that?
Okay.
Moved and seconded to approve the minutes as presented for September 16th, 2020. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Hi. Hi.
All those opposed say nay. Motion carries. The third item on the agenda is the director's report, the informational summary of the current public works activities. Staff?
Yeah, so I'll introduce this item. So this is the Joe Miller. I'm the interim public works director since Jen Calloway left. So tonight we have the director's report in front of you that we'll entertain questions on. I have the majority of the department heads here to answer questions. We won't go through each line item like we typically do, so we can save time for the main item on tonight's agenda, which is to go over the proposed change orders for the project. So I will entertain any questions on the director's report.
I have one. Just a curiosity question, as most of mine are. On page 14 under water operations, you talk about Elena Beach, Marina, and Dogwood had emergency turn-ons. And these are all residential neighborhoods, so why would there be an emergency turn-on?
So we classify an emergency turn on if someone comes in after hours and wants their water turned on the same day. Mm-hmm. So that would be it's just a classification item. So we consider that an emergency. Otherwise, we turn your water service on upon request within 24 hours.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions on the director's report? Tori, do you have anything?
Well, afternoon to
I'm getting
from a citizen.
I'm having you break up, Tori. Could you start over again? Am I the only one that was not able to hear Tori?
I had problems too.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I didn't get any.
Okay, let me try to move up here. I just wanted to add to, maybe it's not part of the director's report, but a request came in by email this afternoon from a citizen asking for a stop sign be installed, four-way stop be put on Dana and Main Street in downtown Morro Bay.
I believe that was Dunes in Maine, right?
Yes.
Oh, Dunes in Maine, right. Excuse me. So I would just add that to a possible maintenance item or something to a proposed addition to infrastructure, street infrastructure, a request by a citizen or something to be considered, a four-way stop sign at Dunes in Maine.
All right. Thank you, Tori. Is there anything else that you had?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do not. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, John, do you have anything?
Yeah, I've got a couple minor things. I'd like to give compliments to Matt Bishop. I sent in a couple of reports of some maintenance requirement for a sidewalk on North Main near Spencer's, and also during the last meeting I mentioned that the vegetation along the west side bike lane on the west side of North Main was making it hard for people to ride, and within a couple of weeks he got that cleared up, and then within 24 hours that I pointed out that there was a pretty big tripping hazard there on the sidewalk there, he got that fixed. So I was very appreciative of what Matt did. Couple other things which popped up. One, let me see what. Who's paying for the design work for the RFP for the City Park Transit Hub project? Is that being paid for by a grant, or is that something the city has to pay for?
The Transit Hub project, the work for that is grant funded. We have a Rural Transit Fund grant, and we have two State of Good Repair grants that we have secured over the 1920 and 2021 fiscal year. We're also going to be using some Transit Development Act, our local transportation funds that we get from the state for that project as well. So there's no general fund monies being used for that project.
Thank you. Let's see. One other question, or a couple other questions, was it that storm drain on, where is that? There's a Sequoia storm drain repair replacement. Is that going to get done this year, or do we put up with whatever damage it does over the winter?
This is Rob Livick, city engineer. As funds are available, we'll continue to do projects, but we'll likely need, before we can fund that one, we'll likely need to go back to council perhaps at the first quarter for an appropriation for that.
Okay,
and I don't believe there's funding available.
And I don't, so what happened? Okay, so Sequoia and Laurel, what happens if we don't fix those during the winter?
In the short term, probably not a whole lot. They're not huge leaks in the storm drain, but they're not going to get any better. So they're going to cause, downstream erosion, probably eventually damage to the street, and will cost more in the long run.
Okay. And then the other one was for the payment program. We've basically suspended all work for last year and this year, except for emergency. Is there a criteria for identifying what emergency work is?
The council appropriated through Measure Q, I believe, was $40,000 for hot mix AC. So mass crews are using that money to do basically potholing.
Okay, if I see something which pretty heavy rutting and stuff, do you want to know about it, or don't worry about it?
Oh yeah. Okay. We'll keep track of those, and as the crews can get to those, we'll do repairs.
Okay, I think that's all I had.
Thank you, John. And remind people to turn your mics off when you are not on the air. Next, Chris, do you have any questions on the director's report?
Not at this time, thank you.
All right, thank you. Doug, do you have any questions or comments on the director's report?
Yes, thanks. I can't imagine a better acting public works director than Joe Mueller. So anyway, on page 15 on the trolley, there's weekly reporting of ridership. And my question is, informally, I ride that bus myself, and I talk to the drivers occasionally, and I'm curious to see, again, the impact of the homeless people riding the bus. If there's any comments there or whatever, because that's certainly an issue. And as the weather gets colder, I imagine that may become a more popular pastime. So that's my question. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug. During the COVID time, when we started to not collect fares and had the shelter at home ordinance, we haven't been experiencing any issues with homeless riders just riding around to get out of the weather or to just have something to do. We haven't heard from the drivers or the transit manager for MV that there has been any issues in that regard. Right now, the ridership, we're reporting to the state so they get a better handle on the transit industry as a whole, and if we're looking for additional funding in a future federal CARES program type measure, that they would have a better idea for how much ridership loss we've had or how much revenue loss the transit industry has had. But as for homeless ridership, we haven't had issues with individuals riding for lengthy period of time outside.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Doug and Janine. I also would like to comment on the pavement improvement, the patchwork that was done there at Paula and Greenwood. That's been needing a large area patch for a long time, and it looks beautiful right now. I also received that email from Sean Green, and I sent a note back to him agreeing that I think there is a problem at that intersection, and not only with the vehicle accidents, but it's a popular area where a lot of pedestrians try to cross Main Street, and it's difficult for the cars to slow down at that area. Or it's not so much difficult, it's just that people don't pay that much attention to the pedestrians as they're trying to cross. So I do hope that sometime in the future we can address the possibility of changing that to a four-way stop. With that, we'll move on to the, unless there's any last minute comments on the director's report, we'll move on to the next item.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Rob, what is this? I forget what they call it, but there's some criteria for putting a stop sign. Has Dune and Maine been looked at for a four-way stop?
Yes, we do have a criteria. We use the California Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices to evaluate a intersection for traffic control devices, and it needs to be warranted to require that installation. In fact, in 2015, City Council adopted Resolution 67-15, which said, in part, no unwarranted traffic control devices shall be allowed within the city rights-of-way, within the jurisdictional boundaries of the city, whether installed by city forces or private parties. So we do require some analysis of those intersections before we put in any traffic control devices. There are several warrants that are possibilities that could be met. There's volume warrants, there's pedestrian warrants, and there are collision warrants. Typically, on the collision warrants, it's 5 collisions within a year is a typical number. Very few intersections in Morro Bay warrant a stop sign or any traffic control device. Most of the ones that were put in the downtown were unwarranted.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. With that, we will end the director's report. And I guess one last thing about the director's report, or not so much the director's report, but just the general announcements, that there are 5 potential vacancies on the Public Works Advisory Board. So I hope the public realizes that they have an opportunity to apply for the Public Works Advisory Board, and they should contact staff, go to the Morro Bay website to apply for next year. There are 4 members whose terms will be expiring, and it's encouraged that, I'm encouraging them to reapply, and there's 1 vacant position that has been vacant for several months. So there will at least be 1 definite opening for a new member. So with that little announcement, we will now move on to item 4, which is the review of the potential change orders for the water reclamation facility. Yes, Eric and Joe and Rob have this, so I'll turn it over to them for a presentation.
Yeah, so Eric's going to handle this item, and he'll be starting with the presentation.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board, Eric Caceres, the city's WRF program manager. Thank you for having me here this evening to talk about item number 4, which is a review of 12 change orders, potential change orders that we're bringing for your review and comment. As Joe mentioned, I have a presentation. I'm just going to go ahead and hop over to that. Great. So again, this evening, we're going to be talking about a review of potential change orders for the water reclamation facility. Just a little bit of background, really quickly, I apologize. Just want to minimize that. For a little bit of background, I think that everybody is probably familiar with this process that we've been going through on the design build project for the WRF. But we have, I wanted to go over a little bit the steps. What is a PCO? So again, a PCO is a potential change order that we bring for consideration by PWAB and then finally by approval of City Council. On approval by City Council, the guaranteed maximum price for the water reclamation facility is modified in accordance with these PCOs. And as I mentioned here previously, we have a total of 12 PCOs with a total cost impact of about $835,000. So as I mentioned, I did want to review quickly what is a PCO and how do we get to where we are today. So it really starts with a suggested change to the water reclamation facility. So as we go through and we're working through the process, we identify something either through a review of the plans and specifications or meetings with the design build team. We identify potential changes. So the first thing that we do is we look and see if that change is a material change in the design build scope. So we identify something may have been missed by the design build team or misinterpreted from the contract language. And so that's the first thing that we do before something becomes a PCO. We make sure that one, it's not already in the design build team's scope of work. Then it wouldn't become a PCO because it wouldn't be a contract change. We typically develop a raw order of magnitude cost, an estimate that we first work off of, and this is often kind of the first gate that we go through in terms of moving forward with a potential change. For example, we might identify something that might be a nice to have, and then we get an initial estimate back from the design build team, and it may be on the order of $100,000, and so we sit down and we say, does it really make sense for us to take this any further? This was something that was nice to have, not necessarily need to have, and at $100,000, it isn't something that we're interested in moving forward with. So again, based on that raw order of magnitude cost, we make a decision at the staff level if we're going to move forward. We then go through and we develop a draft PCO. So a draft PCO has a good amount of detail, and it's developed by the design build team's cost estimating group based on the change that we've identified. Our team, our cost estimators at Carollo, review that draft PCO and return any comments back to the design build team. We discuss those comments, and then we develop a final PCO and negotiate. Did receive a question from a member of the board on the negotiation process that we go through. And I just wanted to kind of clarify, there's really two things that we do as it relates to the review and negotiation of the PCOs. And there's really two big items. One is kind of what I just described, where we receive essentially a bill of materials and some unit prices and quantities. And we go through and we vet those based on the change that we've identified. Is the cost estimate accurately reflect that change that we discussed? and are those cost numbers accurate, or do we agree with those cost numbers? And the second really important thing is we go through and we identify, and there'll be some of that here and as our discussion, we go through the discussion tonight, and we look and we say, well, is that really something that should be included in this PCO? So oftentimes there's kind of ancillary items that might be related to a change, and we may take issue with those items. So when I talk about negotiation, it could be we don't agree with a couple of your unit costs, or it could be that we don't agree that the scope of work that you've identified for the change meets our intent, or it includes extraneous items that the city should not be liable for. Again, we're going to talk about a total of 12 PCOs this evening, and as at least one of you pointed out, the table in the staff report only included 11 line items, and that was because I inadvertently left off the 12th line item, which is PCO number 85. It's essentially a non-cost PCO that will be settled as part of amendment number 4, and it does have a cost to it, and we'll go through that here in just a minute as we start to go through the individual PCOs. Again, the total cost impact is $835,000, and all of that is in terms of a cost increase. We are not bringing forward any credits for consideration by PWAB here this evening. A little note, amendment number 4 would reduce the remaining contingency for the water reclamation facility component of the project to about $614,000. So here's a breakdown of where we were in May when we presented the previous batch of PCOs that made up amendment number 3. Those PCOs were presented to PWAB and brought to City Council and approved by City Council. So through May, we had a total value of the amendment of about $7.7 million. And at that point in time, we did ask to amend the budget to include about $2.9 million of additional budget for the water reclamation facility component of the project, which left us with a contingency of about $1.5 million. So with approval of amendment number 4, here's where we would sit now. The total amendment value would go up to about $8.5 million, resulting in a new guaranteed maximum price of $75.8 million, and would bring our contingency down to just over $614,000. The breakdown of cost increases, as you can see from this chart here, there are a couple of larger PCOs that are really driving this $835,000 amendment. And again, I've identified every single PCO, all 12 of them that we're going to go through here this evening. But I will spend a little bit more time on some of the larger PCOs in the interest of time. But again, I can answer any questions about any of the PCOs after the presentation. As we have done with the last several amendments, we take those PCOs and we identify the rationale for inclusion of those PCOs. So you'll see there's really 3 main categories that are driving the total PCO value here this evening. It's environmental constraints, about $250,000 or a little less than a third of the total cost. Improved operations, which we'll go through. A number of these PCOs were identified early on in the design process, and only now have we brought them to PWAB and City Council for final review and approval because we have the information necessary to identify the magnitude of those costs. And then we have changing conditions, and this item is primarily related to the soil slip that we've discussed at previous PWAB and City Council meetings. We also have a little bit of cost associated with reliability and redundancy, and no items related to construction cost savings, as I mentioned earlier, or necessarily long-term O&M savings. Sometimes that can flex between improved operations and long-term O&M cost savings. So those 2 categories can sometimes blend into each other there. So as I have done in previous amendment discussions, I'm going to go through these. The PCO is not in their numerical order, but in the order as they've been grouped into these different categories. And I'm going to start with kind of the largest category first and kind of focus on a couple of the larger categories first, and then talk a little bit about reliability, redundancy, and some of the smaller items towards the end. The first item is the CDFW site access restrictions. Again, this was something that we've discussed at numerous public meetings. This is PCO 71. As you can see in this slide, we have the erosional feature, which was the key element that we had been in discussions with CDFW going back into late 2018, early 2019. And this erosional feature was identified in the environmental document and subsequent environmental reports. And we worked with both the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and determined that we did not need a 401 or 404 determination for this erosional feature, that it was not jurisdictional as a water of the state or a water of the United States. But we had some issues with California Department of Fish and Wildlife in terms of getting their concurrence on this. So as a result, we issued a notice to proceed on March 20th of 2020, but the contractor was not allowed to enter that erosional feature until we got the final streambed alteration agreement in July 14th of 2020. So as we have discussed also previously, we worked very closely with the design build team to try to mitigate as much of the impacts to the project cost and schedule as we could. And we had originally estimated this impact up to about $1 million. Again, at one point in time, we took and we bifurcated this particular issue into two separate PCOs. This PCO that we're talking about here really has to do with the value of the additional work that we've done with, that we asked the design build team to do to mitigate the issue and kind of work around and change the order of their work. We received a draft PCO value of $589,000. I'll call it $590,000 from the design build team. Upon review of that cost estimate, we negotiated a value of about $554,000. And as you'll notice, the negotiated GMP impact is only $254,000 because we have decided to essentially use our remaining environmental allowance that we have for the project to help reduce the impact to the GMP for this particular change order. Because it is environmentally related, we can't do that. And I can answer any questions if folks are not familiar with the allowance, the environmental allowance that was included in the original GMP value. The second component, this is the elusive 12 PCO that was inadvertently not referenced in the staff report. This is PCO 85. Again, it has to do with the site access from the CDFW issue. But is the compensable delay. So essentially, the design build team claimed that because of the delay in their access to this erosional feature, it therefore delayed the construction and extended the construction end date. And as a result, they requested additional general conditions cost to cover that schedule extension. We brought on a P6 scheduling expert to review the baseline schedule and the delay claims. And upon review, we identified that the work that we requested as part of PCO 71 eliminated any schedule delays. So the changes that we made actually didn't result in an increase in the project schedule. And so that draft PCO value that was presented to us for $562,000, we essentially negotiated that down to zero. So just to summarize the CDFW issue, we had initially estimated that it could cost about $1 million. The potential GMP impact was essentially what the design build team brought to us was just over $1.1 million. And at the end of the day, the actual impact of the GMP that we, through negotiation and through use of our environmental allowance we have available, only resulted in a cost increase to the GMP of just over, of just over $250,000. So that is the environmental constraints category. We had, if you've gone back and looked at previous staff reports from either PWAB or from city council meetings, You'll notice that we've called that category either environmental constraints or environmental constraints / biological opinion, because most of those are driven by the biological opinion that we previously agreed to with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So you may notice those terms kind of used interchangeably. Then we'll move on to improved operations. So we have a number of PCOs that we had identified again earlier in the process that were aimed at trying to make operations more streamlined in the future. So you can see the number on this one is a dead giveaway that it was something that we had identified quite a while back. I think we identified this back at the end of 2018. And this has to do with getting like equipment across different processes. And again, we had this as a kind of a placeholder in our PCO log because we couldn't really identify the impacts until we went through some of our major equipment procurements. So just to go into a little bit of detail on how the equipment procurement process works for this particular design build project. We have a contract with the design build team or agreement with the design build team that says for different processes, they have to use a select group of manufacturers. And in this particular case, we're talking about blowers or compressors that we use throughout different processes within the wastewater treatment process. So they have a list of different manufacturers that they can choose from and they solicit bids from, and they select the lowest cost of those particular listed manufacturers. And if for some reason the city wants to not go with that selected manufacturer that is lowest cost, then we can do so at a cost to the city. So in this particular case, we reviewed the blower information that came back from the procurement and identified that by going with the second low manufacturer, we could keep equipment consistent across the facility. I think there's a total of 7 blowers that could be kind of half and half by different manufacturers, or we could stick with one manufacturer. The benefit of that is long-term operations and maintenance. The facilities is only dealing with a selected number of manufacturers for maintenance and those kinds of things. Maintenance activities in terms of the preventative maintenance activities are the same between different pieces of equipment. And so we had originally estimated the budget for this PCO at about $75,000. And after all was said and done with the equipment procurement, this draft PCO value was presented at $17,426. After our review, this is one where there wasn't a whole lot of negotiation here. We were vetting the cost numbers that the DB team had received from the manufacturers. That was identified and negotiated to $17,000. The next item is PCO 73. This is man gates in the perimeter fencing. So previously, during the design of the project, we had identified PCO 49. It was about $103,000, and it included some changes to the exterior fencing for the project. It included several different man gates. It included some other things, including some gravel that was to be placed underneath the entire perimeter of the fence. And at the end of the day, when the cost came back, city staff made the decision to not move forward with this PCO. However, we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater because we did identify moving forward that we really did need to keep a portion of that PCO. It was going to be important for operations to have a couple of man gates in the exterior fence, but not the number that we had previously identified. So we walked that back pretty significantly. We also did not include the gravel that was to be, or the crushed rock that was to be provided underneath the fencing. We didn't move forward with that because of the price tag. But we did identify a concrete walkway between the different the different areas of the treatment plant. And so what started as about $103,000 PCO, we reduced that down to about $27,000. And again, we reviewed that PCO value and determined, and we were in agreements with the $27,000 cost estimate. So that's what's being presented for PCO 73. PCO 74, which is parking canopy electrical receptacles. One of the items that wasn't expressly identified in the RFP and the design build agreement previously was the inclusion of receptacles at the parking canopy areas at the treatment plant where staff's vehicles will be parked. So one of the items that was added was it's a total of 7 outdoor rated duplex 120 volt electrical outlets on the different poles throughout the canopy, so that the city can use that to charge batteries and those kinds of things. Again, we didn't really have an original estimate for that. That was something that we identified through the design process and said, yes, this is definitely something that we need to add, and went straight to the development of the draft PCO. That draft PCO was reviewed, and the program management team and the city agreed with that estimate of $42,000. The next item is PCO 79, which is a modification to the water and collection system supply sheds. In the kind of the storage area near the operations and administration building areas of the facility, there were 2 sheds that were originally included in the design, and one was for water and one was for sewer. As part of PCO 50 that we brought to council as part of amendment number 3 back in May of this last year, we made the decision to push those 2 buildings together, get rid of the center dividing wall, and we added a couple of roll-up doors and some other improvements to the inside of that building. As we moved the design forward in working with Mr. Miller and his staff, we identified the need to increase the size of those roll-up doors from 8 foot to 12 foot, and we also added some additional plumbing inside this building for a shop sink and some other things. And so this draft PCO was brought to us at about just over $10,000, almost $11,000. After reviewing that PCO, we were in agreement with that $10,847 estimate. So that's what's included in PCO 79. PCO 82 is again, this is very similar to the previous PCO that I discussed, where we were talking about like equipment, and we were looking at those process compressors or blowers. This is a continuation of PCO 37 that was brought to PWAB and City Council back in May. Essentially, that PCO 37 handled a number of the pieces of equipment that we had procured at that time, mainly the MVR and the reverse osmosis equipment and the UV disinfection equipment, and the change order was covering kind of the uniformity of the instrumentation equipment for those different packages. Essentially, this PCO, as I mentioned, is an extension of PCO 37 and extends the same type of instrumentation equipment to the belt press that will use for dewatering of the biosolids that are produced by the facility, and the safe system that's used for treatment of high stormwater flows. Again, trying to get like equipment throughout the facility, and these are the changes that we're recommending to do that. Again, this draft PCO value was brought to us at almost $109,000. Upon review of these PCOs, which were essentially quotes from the manufacturers to provide this equipment that may not be their standard, but is consistent with the other packages that we're installing as part of the project, the negotiated PCO value, again, is $109,000. We were in agreements with the information that was provided for these. So those are some of the two of the larger categories, and we'll go through the remaining categories here. And I did leave one item towards the end that I think will take a little bit of additional time. So I'm going to go through these next items that are on the small side very quickly. This first one is PCO 75. This is the installation of a security window at the admin building. This change was identified back earlier in 2020 when the city started to make modifications to some of its other city buildings, mainly City Hall and Public Works, where there were some security measures put in for interaction between staff and the public. Again, this one we moved forward with, I don't want to say irregardless of cost, but we had a pretty good idea that the impacts would not be too large for this PCO. And so we really moved into the draft PCO stage. That PCO was identified at just over $11,000. And based on our review, we concurred with that estimate. Over to the right there, you can see essentially a cut sheet of what we're looking at here. It's a security glass panel and a speaking tube for interaction with the public there at the city's new administration building at the work site. It's the only PCO that's categorized as operator safety. We'll then move on to reliability and redundancy. PCO 76, pretty late in the design process, we identified that while we had redundancy and we had the RFP had asked for redundancy for a number of the chemical systems at the facility, for some reason it did not include redundancy for the sodium bisulfite system. For those of you not familiar with that, this is kind of the last line of defense. As after the wastewater is chlorinated or disinfected with sodium hypochlorite, you use sodium bisulfite to quench the residual chlorine in the water, which is required as part of the city's discharge permit before the water goes out to the outfall. So one of the things that we added were, again, heated blankets for the sodium bisulfite tote. This says tanks, this should be totes. We're using 300-gallon totes for sodium bisulfite, redundant totes. So heated blankets were something that were not asked for previously, but were added based on the freezing point of sodium bisulfite. And then also an additional sodium bisulfite pump was added. Again, the draft PCO value for this was $58,000. We reviewed that PCO and agreed with the $58,000 estimate there. So again, an additional sodium bisulfite pump and the heated blankets. To the right, you can see a little diagram. The elements in red are the new elements in the process and instrumentation diagrams. Just a little way to show exactly what we're talking about. Changing conditions. This is one category, kind of the third of the three major categories that comprise the $835,000 price tag for amendment number 4. The first one is PCO 72, the owner trailer utility hookups. For those of you who have been on the site, we do have a number of trailers on site. A couple of those are associated with the design build team. They have a trailer, as well as our electrical subcontractor has a trailer on site. The program manager also has a trailer. So when our trailer was delivered, we had the opportunity to either facilitate utility hookups for that and charge the city for those utility hookups, or to ask the help of the design build team to provide utility hookups to the program management trailer. We also asked them to install a mailbox at the end of the driveway. And I assure you that the utility hookups comprise the vast majority of, for those of you that have looked at the details of the PCO, the vast majority of this PCO, that's just shy of $20,000. Again, upon our review, that number was acceptable to the program management team. Water shutoff valve in Teresa Road. This is an item that was requested by city staff to do some potholing to verify the valve arrangement in the street. And so this resulted in a relatively small change order of about $5,000 for the potholing activity and the backfilling and the paving of that pothole there in Teresa Road to uncover and better characterize what was going on under the ground. Our last PCO is one of our larger PCOs. Again, this is another one that we have been talking about for a number of months. And this is the soil slip or the landslide that occurred at the water reclamation facility back in May of 2020. Here is a diagram showing the size of the soil slip. This is an aerial with the dimensions here. And you can see there's a couple of people that are standing there above that fissure that occurred there in the ground. It occurred while earthwork activity was happening kind of below on this cut slope that the design build team was working on. So again, the landslide occurred. It was it was noticed on the afternoon, evening of May 5th. Our original thought was this landslide had occurred through activities that were caused by the design build team, and we did an exhaustive analysis of their geotechnical report. So maybe I'll just get into quickly before I talk about the analysis that was completed by Earth Systems Pacific and Yeh and Associates, who those two firms are. So those are two well-respected geotechnical firms in the San Luis Obispo area. Earth Systems Pacific was hired by the design build team to complete their design level geotechnical report. Yeh and Associates was previously contracted with the city and the previous program manager to do a conceptual level geotechnical report for the site, and that was used as a basis for the design build teams to develop their proposals back in late 2017, early 2018. So after this slip occurred, Earth Systems Pacific, who's the design build team's geotechnical engineer, they came on site and did an analysis of the soil slip and why they thought it had occurred. That report was provided as an attachment to the staff report, and so they completed that report. And we had Yeh and Associates do a peer review of that report, as well as an exhaustive peer review of the design level geotechnical report that was done to finalize the design. And it was the opinion of Earth Systems Pacific that the slip was the result of an ancient landslide, essentially a pre-existing condition. A pre-existing condition that was not identified by either Yeh and Associates through their underground investigations back in 2017, nor was it identified by Earth Systems Pacific through their analysis that was done in either probably would have been early 2019. Yeah, I think it occurred not in late 2018, but early 2019. Yeh reviewed those findings and could not essentially could not come up and disagree with those findings. The cost associated with this PCO is the cost to essentially remove that slipped material and to relocate it to the canyon area. That was the extent of the remediation, as well as some additional engineering cost for redesign of the site, of the civil site work. Our original estimate that we had flagged to City Council back in May when this first occurred was $500,000. We received a draft PCO of about $366,000. And as a result of a review and negotiation, one, identification of items that we did not believe that the city should be responsible for, and number two, identification of some unit costs that we did not agree with. The final negotiated PCO value was reduced down to just over $280,000. So that is the total impact of that soil slip. That constitutes all of the 12 PCOs that were presented in the staff report. So now, if I can answer any questions on any of those.
Okay, thank you, Eric, for that report. Well, let's see, where shall we start? Well, I think I'm going to ask a question first. Normally I wait till the end. On the, you indicated that Ye and Associates peer-reviewed Earth Systems, but who peer-reviewed Ye and Associates on the original analysis? That seems like where all of this should have been picked up. And, why did this happen? Why did they miss it? I looked at some of where they did their test drillings, and it looked like they should have picked this up. Any response on that?
Yeah. So, essentially the work done by Ye was, and I can't answer the question. I asked Rob if anybody had previously peer reviewed Ye's work, but essentially how this process worked is typically when we're doing a conventional delivery project. So we'll point to the pipeline portion of the project, for example. We would have a geotechnical engineer come out and do a geotechnical investigation, a full-blown geotechnical investigation, and based on that, they would make recommendations that the design engineer would then take and use to design the project. For this process, Ye came in and did a cursory geotechnical investigation because it should be the responsibility of the design engineer to essentially make their determination on the geotechnical conditions because they are liable for the design at the end of the day. So what Ye did initially was did a cursory geotechnical report, and that geotechnical report was a way to kind of baseline and set some level of information for the design build teams, the individual design build teams that were proposing on the project to propose on. So, for example, there have been a number of items, or there were several items that were identified in Ye's report that the Earth Systems Pacific came back, and after they finished their report, they said, we don't really agree with Ye based on the additional analysis that we've done. For example, there was a PCO, and the number it escapes me right now, that was negotiated previously, where exactly that happened. Earth Systems came out and said, hey, we've now done our geotechnical investigation, which is to another level of rigor than the one that you previously did, and we found something a little bit different based on our analysis. And Ye looked at that, and we looked at that and said, yeah, you're right. Based on your additional analysis, you don't agree with the work that Ye did, and we negotiated a PCO for some additional improvements that needed to be done below a couple of the water-bearing structures. In this case, Ye's borings did not pick up on some type of pre-existing landslide or something underground. Neither did Earth Systems. And the biggest issue at hand was the recommended slope for that area. Ye came in and said, preliminarily, we believe that you can cut the slope back at a 2-to-1. And Earth Systems Pacific did a very exhaustive slope stability analysis. And at the end of the day, they said, yeah, we agree with that 2-to-1. They cut the slope back at a 2-to-1, and we got the soil slip. And so that's a lot of the analysis that we did was to look at was Earth Systems analysis faulty, and that was done by Ye. And again, Ye had some questions about their slope stability analysis, but at the end of the day, they said that based on if they would have done the same analysis, they would have come to the same conclusion in terms of the slope. So all signs point to this being something that was already pre-existing underground. And when these types of situations happen, they are not things that are the responsibility of the design engineer. The design engineer, is given the site not with the assumption that there is no pre-existing slides or anything like that underground. And if those occur, they're typically the responsibility of the owner.
Yeah, I understand that the design engineers based it on the reports. I was just concerned as how come there isn't more kickback onto the people that generated the reports that we were basing everything on.
In this instance, So that's a good question. But I think that this soil slip was relatively small, or the area where it occurred was relatively small to the whole site. You can't do. It's one of those. It's one of those things where you can't pothole absolutely every, or you can't do borings on every single square inch of the site. And sometimes these things aren't identified during the underground investigation. Do we think that their analysis was sufficient? Yes. But it was something that neither one of these firms did identify in their analysis.
Okay, thank you. I'll let, if anybody else has other questions on that, I'll let them bring that forward. This time I think I'll go in reverse and start with Doug. Do you have any questions of Eric or the team at this time?
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, Eric, could you elaborate on the contractor's environmental allowance?
Sure. So originally, when the city put out the RFP for the project, they said that as part of your guaranteed maximum price in your proposal, you shall include a $1 million environmental allowance as part of your GMP. So the original GMP for the project was $67.5 million, roughly. So of that, $1 million was held aside for environmental allowance that the city could direct the design build team to use in whatever the way they saw fit as it related to environmental items. So we started off with about $1 million, and we initially used that $1 million allowance to make some modifications to the stormwater system. That was proposed by the design build team in order to make the permitting more straightforward with the Regional Water Quality Control Board. We also used some of that environmental allowance to cover the biological monitoring, the archaeological and paleontological monitoring for the site that was required and identified as part of the environmental, the program, Project EIR. So we had used those two items had taken up roughly, I'd say roughly half of that $1 million allowance. And so we have about $400,000 left, and the decision was made to, another item that we had was the temporary exclusion fence that we had to put up for the red-legged frog. That needed to be put up as the first item at the start of construction. So we had about $350,000 left in that allowance, and the decision was made to use 300 of that to reduce the impact of this amendment on the GMP.
Thank you, Eric.
Do you have anything else, Doug?
No, I'm listening, but that's good. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Chris, do you have any questions at this time?
Just a couple comments. I mean, just, on the soils and the two engineering firms, it's just my opinion, if you're going to vet firms to look over one another's work, they kind of shouldn't come from the same sandbox. It just leaves opportunity for collusion or, very small town, very small industry. And sometimes, there's a tendency to want to agree with one another to keep the local working conditions peaceful. Some of those other costs, I just question why, if we turn over, our dollars to subject matter experts, why are we at 80 plus change orders at a very early stage of a project? I used to build and develop for many, many years of my life. And, it seems like there's not very much shift of liability occurring other than asking the city to open the checkbooks. 7 outlets, even with conduit and stuff, you're approaching $6,000 an outlet for 120 only. We're not talking, charging stations for electric vehicles. Some of these costs in general just seem steeped, very, very large numbers. I just connected a whole series.
You're breaking up, Chris.
Of $20,000. So I just see pretty big concerns and pretty big red flags. And the numbers we're approaching at this stage of the game, we're set to go over the budget and the estimate by double digits percentage wise. So I think it's a pretty.
Any response for that, Eric or Joe? Or
I did want to address the question about the geotechnical firms. Again, I don't want to say that we hired one we hired a firm to vet the other. It's just the nature of the way that this process works. The city used Ye and Associates to develop the initial geotechnical report, the planning level geotechnical report. And the design build team was told that you need to do your own geotechnical report. And the only constraints that were put on them were you can't use Ye and Associates because that's a conflict, because they had previously done the planning level work. So as a result, the design build team was able to choose who they wanted to do that work. And they chose Earth Systems Pacific, who happens to be another well-respected firm in the area. So it's one of those things where we didn't tell the contractor who to hire. We told them who they couldn't hire. But in terms of collusion or something like that, I fully trust the work that Ye and Associates did to review that. And at the end of the day, they couldn't find conclusive evidence to say that it wasn't a pre-existing slide. And so that was the situation that we were faced with.
Okay, thank you. See, next we'll go to Jan. Do you have any questions at this time? Your mic is still muted, Jan.
Okay. Eric, thank you for the explanation. I read everything that was presented that was sent to me, and this helped a lot. But so now you're saying on the red-legged frog fence, we get a credit of $300,000. Is that already put back into the budget? So is this $835,000? Would have been $300,000 more for our total price, or is this already is the $300,000 put back in the budget, and this $835,000 is separate from that?
Yeah. So the $835,000 is separate. So that does not include what we're hoping is going to be on the order of about $300,000 credit to the project budget as a result of the work that we're currently doing. And maybe I'll just elaborate on that quickly. I didn't cover it in the presentation, but it was in the staff report. When we negotiated the biological opinion with the United States Fish and Wildlife last year, we were under the gun to do that, and we brought forward a fence design that had been used in another place in the county by our project biologist, and we were a little bit concerned at that time. It was obviously a big number in terms of cost, to over $800,000. And so we'd always kept it in the back of our minds that once we got the project into construction, the construction of that fence is well down the line, that we would approach Fish and Wildlife and say, once we had some time to work through this and identify some potentially more cost-effective options, we would bring those to them for consideration. So we have working through the EPA, who is the one that has connectivity with U.S. Fish and Wildlife on this consultation. We got their buy-off first. to say, hey, we have a different solution here that looks like it could save the city a good amount of money. We'd like to get your buy-off to bring that to Fish and Wildlife. They have said yes, that is okay. And we've also brought that to Fish and Wildlife and got a preliminary yes. It looks like one of the options that you're bringing to us will be acceptable. So, well, again, we in a perfect world, we would have had all of these things come together. We would have brought a smaller a list of PCOs to you, or a smaller amendment. But I think it's just too early right now to say with 100% confidence that we're going to be able to do this. I think we have a very, very good chance. And we're just working on the detailed cost estimate to identify exactly what the dollar amount's going to be.
So you use the words too early. So where in the process are you? Are you far enough into the process to have an idea of how many more cost overruns you will encounter, or is it? Are they?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the statement was made earlier about being early on in this process, and I'd say that we are very well down the road. And so while the construction is about 30% complete, 25 to 30% complete, we are essentially out of the ground, which is where we have a lot of, or there can be some risk there as we move forward through construction. We've completed nearly all of our large equipment procurements that we needed to do, so those are all completed. And the design is 100% complete. And as you remember, a lot of the change orders, as they should, came through this process through design and not through construction. So typically in design build, when we have issues with construction, when we encounter things, oftentimes the city can be caught in the middle between a design engineer and a contractor. And in this case, the design engineer and the contractor are one and the same. So we avoid a lot of those issues. So we've identified the vast majority of change orders. And currently, to memory, I think we're only tracking 2 change orders right now. And the magnitude of the change orders is relatively small. We do have COVID hanging over us in terms of the design build the design build entity has early on in this construction process had issued us a letter for the right to claim for additional costs as they relate to COVID. We don't know what those will be. We don't know if those will be anything at this point in time. But really, outside of that. And another change order that we're working through on some conduit changes that we potentially might be making to the project. Those are really the only two items that we're tracking currently.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see Tori on the panel anymore. Did he get dropped off? But we'll go to John at this time. John, do you have anything?
Yeah, I have several things I was curious about. To be honest, when I got the package and started going through it, I found it, I asked the city to print it out so I could, didn't have to use my 3 sheet a minute printer for the thing. But the table, what you had there, didn't help me as much as I would have wanted to. So during your discussion there, you discussed your draft PCO amount. Is that equivalent to your engineering estimate? Eric?
Can you say that one more time?
You've got, during your presentation, you had a thing, prices, which said draft PCO. Is that like your engineer's estimate, or do you have anything like that to show that you evaluated what your negotiation position was going to be?
Yeah, so the draft PCO value is the initial, we sit down with the design build team and we say, okay, this is the change that we've identified. We've identified it's a change of scope. They say, we think it's going to be about $50,000 in terms of the change. And we say, that's where we say yes or no. And if we say yes and we want to move forward with that draft PCO value is essentially they go back to the table with their construction cost estimators, and they put together a detailed cost estimate, and they bring that to us. And that is the draft PCO value. So that's the starting point for our negotiation.
So that's a proposal amount, is that right?
That's a proposal. Yeah, that's a proposal amount. That's a good way to phrase it.
Okay. Then the original estimate, that was what was originally submitted, but was taken over by the draft PCO. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that original estimate is usually a pretty high level estimate. That's that could be something that we sit around the table and say, we start walking through it and say, okay, this change affects this item, this item, this item. It's about $10,000 for this, about $20,000 for this. When all said and done, we think that this is kind of come in somewhere order of magnitude, $50,000, $75,000, $100,000. And as I mentioned, that's kind of our initial, does it pass the initial test to say, yeah, this is something that we want to move forward with. In some instances, because it's definitely something that we need to add to the project, we don't even necessarily go through that process. We say, okay, we know that we need to put in this exclusion fence for the red-legged frog. This is the parameters, develop the draft. It's complex. We can sit here and throw numbers at the wall, but at the end of the day, you need to bring us back a detailed construction estimate or proposal for us to review.
Okay, then did Carollo engineers independently kind of come up with a target amount for the proposed change orders?
Yeah, so we review all of those change orders. As I mentioned, it's kind of a two-pronged approach. Typically, myself and our construction manager are looking at those change orders and saying, are all of the items appropriate? So sometimes the change order can be taken a little bit liberally, and some things get thrown into the estimates that aren't really appropriate and shouldn't be included in the change order. And we say, no, we don't think that was particularly with something like the soil slip, for example, where we're asking the design build team to do extra work. And we'll say, well, we didn't ask you to do that. You should have already been doing that. That's not something that should be included in this change order amount. So that's one level of review. And then the other level of review is when we have that detailed list that we're all in agreement on. That goes to our Carollo's construction estimating team, and they pick through that and say, yeah, you're not using the right labor rates for these crafts. You're not using the right number of hours for these crafts. This should take 60 hours for a laborer, not 85 hours for a laborer, those types of things. And the labor rates aren't correct. Your equipment rates aren't right. You should only need to be using this equipment, not this equipment. So that's the level of review that's done by the Carollo side.
Did the Carollo estimator give you a number for each PCO of what he would think is reasonable?
He doesn't typically give a number that he thinks is reasonable, but what he will say is, he will say, and that could be back engineered, but essentially he will say, I question the cost per linear foot for this conduit. On other PCOs or on other parts of the job, it was this. Use $40 a linear foot, not $67 a linear foot. He comes back with those types of things, and we document those in a change log, and then the design build team then comes back and says, for one reason or another, they either agree with those changes or they push back on those changes, and that's where we have a discussion about those things.
I spent several years with the Corps of Engineers doing this stuff, and the way the Corps had handled it was, you've got your contractor doing his stuff there, and then you would have a Corps estimator who basically would do his own, he'd have an estimate for the project, and he'd do a little ancillary estimate for a change order. So there was a number he was thinking of. And you kind of look at that, see if you agreed with it or not. I don't see that. So you didn't really have an estimate to work against. You had a feeling of whether or not the right numbers were being used or not. Is that right?
Yeah, and I would say that that's not completely different than what we're doing. I think that myself and more specifically our construction manager is the first one that when we get a draft PCO, he typically has a number in his head that he has worked with Roy in our cost estimating team to say, yeah, we got this PCO and it came back in at 100,000. I would have thought that this would be somewhere close, around 50,000. I think that in looking at this, I think we could throw out these couple of line items that aren't applicable, and they'll work together, and they have been working together since we started construction on the construction related PCOs to kind of, as you mentioned, there's a number that they're shooting for. So kind of a top down and a bottom up approach to review of those construction PCOs.
Okay. Well, I'm not completely comfortable with that. It'd be nice to have, the table which was put together. I don't know if you put it together or somebody else did, where the PCO was listed and description and stuff like that. It would be good to have like a proposal number, whether the proposal number was found to be reasonable or for needed adjustments, and then the final cost. So you knew what came in. You at least a checkoff box saying yes, it was reasonable or wasn't reasonable, and what you finally negotiated. I really like that idea from Jeff Heller to have, is it owner, contractor, or agency generated? So for 30, was that owner generated, or was that contractor or agency? Probably owner. PCO 30.
Can you is that the consistency?
The sludge butter blowers.
Yeah, that was an owner driven request.
CDF. Okay, the next one down, 71's Fish and Wildlife site access restrictions. That was generated by an agency?
Yeah, that was driven by an agency. That's correct.
Okay. Owner trailer utility hookup. That was from you. Is that right?
Yeah, but that is one that. Regardless of the way that cost was going to be handled, it either would have been something that we would have charged back to the city. So it could have been a Corolla charge that would have been charged back to the city, or in looking at it, it was more cost effective to have the DB team.
Okay, so work. Yeah, essentially it was contractor generated. You had two different contractors. How much? What was the difference in price between what you would have had to charge and what FBV had?
I do not have that number off the top of my head. I can get that information for you.
Okay. 13,000 for man gigs seems pretty steep. Was there more work than just the man gates? Besides, a little bit of concrete and stuff like that, but it still seems kind of.
Yeah, it was some concrete steps and a concrete path and the man gates, and I don't have, let me see here, let me just pull up the detailed PCO. There could have been a couple of other miscellaneous items that we brought back in there with that.
Is that an owner generated, or is that that's owner generated?
That was an owner generated, yeah.
I kind of agree with Doug that I'd like to make sure those canopy electrical receptacles are gold plated. Did you guys look at maybe putting in blank conduits and letting city staff take care of it in the future when they need it?
I think it was one of those things that we'd identified as being an immediate need for city staff and something that wasn't included previously. And I would ask, I don't believe that was something that we considered.
All right. Bisulfate pump was owner generated?
Yeah, that was owner and engineer generated. I think that was one where, and I'll just
now,
say,
by owner and engineer, what do you mean? Do you mean?
I think the program manager also agreed with. It was something that we had and kind of collectively all identified as we were a little bit surprised, frankly, that we let it get to a pretty high level of completion without realizing that we didn't have a redundant bisulfite pump, and in a lot of other cases, we had redundant pumps on the other chemical systems. And regarding how important those sodium bisulfite pumps are, we thought it was prudent to include that. I can't speak to why specifically in the RFP it had identified a single bisulfite pump, but that was a change that was generated by either the city or us as the program manager.
Okay, so the program manager is the city's representative. Is
correct?
Okay. This soil slip. What sort of material slipped? Was it all the same material from 10 feet above to 10 feet below, or was there something about that little slip plane that was part of the reason that it happened?
I'm admittedly I'm not a geologist, and there's a pretty good analysis that was provided in there by Earth Systems Specific. And yeah, the material that slipped was Franciscan melange soil. That can be problematic, but essentially the rationale for the slip was that there was a pre-existing slide that had occurred, and essentially that had been disturbed with the earthwork activity that had been done.
Was it considered bedrock or soil?
I believe it's considered soil. I would have to go either back to the geotech report or have Ye answer that question.
Let's see. Okay. The water supply, I'm not too worried. I assume that was owner. SCADA uniformity, I assume is owner.
Correct.
The water shut-off valve. What, they just found a valve was missing when they tried to check something, or what?
Joe, do you want to address the water valve?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So on the water valve, it's the contractor for the DB team had to tie into the existing city system out in the street, and it was showing them tying in essentially at the property line right outside of the street. City staff went out there, excavated the area, found that that our maps weren't correct, showing the right size line. We tried isolating the line and allowing them to go back into the street and do the tie-in. When we actually operated the valves out in the street, we found that those weren't actually connected to the line. Whale rock also runs right through that area with some lines. So since it was excavating right in the driveway to the construction site, we felt it would be best to bring the contractor on board and work directly with him and the equipment that was on site to excavate and do it more as a team effort than having us there blocking the driveway to the construction site while they have heavy equipment trying to come in. So that's why we did it together as a team.
Okay, and then when I used to do these things, I'd have to put in a rationale, basically a negotiation memorandum. At least explain why this stuff needed to be done. And a lot of that stuff, which you had in your proposal, it would have been nice to see before, so I didn't have to say, what's this about? I mean, just looking at the stuff you had there, I could not guess the reasonable whether the numbers were reasonable or not. It would have been really nice to have some better information there. Be really nice for you to help Public Works present this stuff to the city council, so the city council doesn't have to ask why. Rather than having you to go through the dog and pony show the way you did. And then the other thing that pops into my mind is, since this is a cost reimbursement, the only thing we're negotiating here is profit. Did you guys recommend profit for all these change orders, or was there some of them where maybe like at bisulfate redundancy? If their instructions was to make it redundant and they didn't, theoretically that profit is not eligible.
I think that's a good example. And we didn't ask them to make it redundant, and later identified that we wanted it to be redundant.
Okay.
And in terms of profit, the profit is it's a fixed overhead and profit.
As long as it's a reasonable, as long as it's not due to contractor error, it's fixed. But if there is some culpability on the mistake by the contractor, was that looked at all?
Well, if it's the mistake of the contractor or something that should have been included, then you guys won't see it because it won't come to you as a PCO. It has to pass that fundamental clearance, and if it is something that we deem is already included as part of the contractor's scope of work, or something that they were already supposed to be doing, and we identify a change and it gets put into that category, then we don't go down the PCO path. That is something that we note as a design clarification, and that change gets made to the project without any cost impact to the city.
So have there been any design clarifications which have impacted construction cost?
Yeah, we just had one recent one with we have a pump station that's located on site that was pumping into the influent lines that are feeding the treatment plant. And we identified, or Joe identified the issue, and we noted that we wanted to make a change and significantly increase the length of the pumping line and have it pump into downstream of our flow metering, way on the other side of the plant. So a significant quantity of additional piping. And we raised the issue, and a change order was initiated. And Joe came back and said, "Well, this is a requirement of the permit." And the design build agreement clearly states that the facility that's provided by the design build team has to meet all the permit requirements. So that was a change that was made at no cost to the owner.
Other than the cost of the construction?
No, the cost of the construction. Well, it's not an impact to the GMP. So it is something that will be done under the GMP, but that GMP umbrella essentially includes everything that's required in order to meet the permit requirements.
Yeah, so that clarification will cost the city whatever it costs for the extra pipe, but not profit. Is that right?
No, the profit would be on top of that. That would be additional work items.
Okay, I'm confused. If something should have been done a certain way and it wasn't, the contractor gets paid for the cost of doing it the way it was supposed to be. But if the contractor omission caused it, they should not receive profit.
No, the assumption was that it was always going to be done that way under the GMP, and so they are eligible to do that work. So we told them do it the way that we said that you should do it, and they do that work, and that work gets invoiced, and they get profit on top of that.
Well, the way I understand a cost reimbursement contract here in California is you set a price based on the construction of what the profit is going to be. That profit doesn't change unless it's approved in a negotiation. And if construction costs would exceed that profit level, that's too bad for the contractor. He still gets his cost. He doesn't get the profit if there was an error in the design. So
that's not the way that this contract is a cost plus contract.
It's a fixed price. It's not cost plus because that's illegal. It's a cost plus fixed profit.
Correct.
So a fixed profit means the profit cannot change unless it's negotiated and approved by council.
I would either have to have the city attorney comment on that or my contracts person comment on that, but I don't, that's not, off the top of my head, that's not my interpretation of this design build contract.
Okay, well, look into that. I know that I had, under pain of death, had to learn that stuff. So profit is not allowed to change once it's negotiated at the beginning, unless there's a change order and the additional profit is approved.
I'll have to look at that because that's not the way that the contract is. I don't believe is the way our contract is structured. We have a GMP.
If you're dealing with federal funds, it's the way it's structured.
Okay, I'll look into that and get back to you.
All right, or at least get back to the city.
Okay.
I do appreciate your presentation there because it kind of helped everything kind of get to the point where I understood what you were trying to do. Thank you. That's all my question.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you for that contracting question.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Okay, Tori, I see that you're there. Do you have any questions at this time?
I do. I have one question, basically, and then another sort of issue that I'd like to just mention since we're talking about PCOs here on this. By the way, Mr. Cesaris, I appreciate you doing your fiduciary duty here in negotiating, vetting these PCOs, and in many instances, reducing the amounts that the city is obligated to pay. I'd just like you to, in many of these, I'm okay with, I guess I would say, but I'd just like to hear, like on PCO number 71, where you basically reduced what the original builder was asking by about 75 to 80% of their total requests. The original PCO was 1.1 million, and now it's 254,000. This is the CDFW mitigation or whatever that little component is. But what were you taking out? That's almost $1 million worth of a PCO request. What kind of, is that just loaded, padded expenses, or what came out of that negotiation? Yeah,
so there's really two pieces to the PCO, and I'll use some round numbers here. But we got a PCO for $1.1 million, we got a PCO for $1.1 million, and we made the decision to split that into two separate PCOs because they were two separate issues. One of them was, hey, we've asked you to do this extra work as a result of continuing to keep the job moving in a time where the contractor was on site but couldn't do the work how they had planned to do the work. And then the other piece was we've delayed you, so as a result of the delay, you guys are claiming additional money, and that was about a 50-50 split. So 1.1 million, 550,000 on one side, $550,000 roughly on the other side. And so,
why so? Okay, that was just
go ahead.
Very split, I guess.
It wasn't an arbitrary split. Those are two different things. One was additional work that we asked them to do in terms of actually physically moving dirt, altering their planned construction activities, the sequencing of those, and that was about $550,000. The other piece was because we had to do all these things, we didn't have access to the site. We need to extend the contract duration by this amount of time. And the result of that contract extension, we have to carry all of our staff for this additional time. And the impact of that is another $550,000. So very quickly, we, as you'll see, or as you might remember from the presentation, they came to us and said, our estimate for the actual activities that we performed, additional activities, was just shy of $600,000. And we looked at that and we negotiated with them, made note of a couple items that we didn't think were applicable, and that number came down to about $550,000. So we didn't really move the needle very much in terms of the hard construction dollars that we're talking about. Where we were able to make significant reductions is on the time side. And that's where we looked at the schedule and said, by doing all these changes, we've completely mitigated any kind of schedule delay. So you're not entitled to, we don't believe you're entitled to $1 of the $562,000 delay portion of this PCO, or the delay PCO. We don't think you're going to need extra time to get the job done now. So we essentially cut the PCO value in half. The additional savings to get from about $550,000 to $250,000 is the use of the environmental allowance. So, this work is still is going to cost the city $550,000. We're just using our environmental allowance budget to cover $300,000 of it. So we're only paying the DB team an additional $250,000 to mitigate the issue. So that's how that breaks down. I know that's a little bit it's a little bit cumbersome, and why would we split those PCOs into two different PCOs? That was pretty calculated on our part, and there's a specific reason why we wanted to do that. We wanted to separate those two issues because largely we agreed with the design build team in the way that they actually handled the additional work and the additional earthwork that we identified. But we had early on, before we got real deep into the schedule, we had some real questions about the schedule delay. And so our intent was to come to a quick, swift negotiation on the actual construction work, put that aside, and then turn our attention to the delay claim that successfully we were able to negotiate that one away.
Well, that sort of leads me to my other issue, which, and Rick, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if this is a valid move at this point, but the last round of PCOs back in May that were brought by the consultant and the DB team were much greater in value, $6 million or so, 5.9 million, with half of that roughly being somewhat similar to what Mr. Cesaris just explained in terms of this, $500,000 in this one PCO here tonight, 71 PCO, the CDFW site, which was $500,000 on just kind of a deep a delay in construction, a delay that was calculated to cost a certain amount, which there was no real cost in a way involved with that. That could be, and in fact got rationalized off the cost table now, thanks to Mr. Cesaris. But this earlier change order bill that the city got in May for $6 million, 10% of the overall WRF cost, total cost, half of that was due to the delay in the start of construction, which and I don't, even to this time, I didn't, Mr. Cesaris, you explained how that number of $3 million was calculated as a result of the delay of starting construction. But as I remember, you said that, it related back to a construction cost index that was put out by a trade magazine, Engineering News Review, and the index was localized to San Francisco area, which, according to the contract with the city and the DB team, that CCI needed to exceed 3%, but it did not exceed 3%. But still, we had the biological opinion, so-called, came to two PCOs, number 59 and 39, that amounted to about $2.4 million, but it was all simply a fictitious kind of cost. There was no invoice being paid. There was no any overhead at that time, or construction crew wages and salaries that were being paid. It was just an estimate of potential cost overrun or potential increases in construction materials and possibly labor and other fees that, in fact, according to the CCI index published by the ENR, never really materialized anyway. So I'm just of the opinion that $2.5 million cost overrun that already we've kind of accepted and has bumped the total cost of of the total WRF project, including the conveyance and injection systems, to 130 up from 126. It should be waived. It's not a real cost. Nobody's being paid. That's just back to John's point. It's just pure profit. It's a pure transfer over to the contractor. And this round of PCOs comes to $835,000. That's kind of a small amount compared to the last round, which was $6 million, and half of that $6 million almost was this delay. Fictitious cost that's just basically pure profit going to the finger. I'm just of the opinion that needs to be highlighted. We didn't really clarify how that number, that dollar value was calculated, especially when the CCI index was virtually flat for the period involved. And, Jen Calloway, the chief financial officer of the city, was managing the project at that time and is no longer with us. And I don't know. I just think that somehow we kind of finessed by that cost overrun, and that's a significant cost overrun. I just think that's something that needs to be flagged, and it'd be helpful if we could understand where that number came from, but it may not be. This may not be the moment to go through all that, but I still am. I still have it's still unexplained and obscure to me that we are being billed for that amount of money.
So the two PCOs that you're referring to had a total value of about $2.4 million, and it was PCO 39, which is the delay of the construction notice to proceed, and PCO 59, which is increased escalation costs. So I will say that both of these delays were. I think there's a fundamental difference between the scheduled delays that we were able to avoid with PCO 85 versus the scheduled delays and the scheduled cost impacts that we have from PCO 39 and PCO 59. In that PCO 39 and PCO 59. And I don't like these PCOs. I don't like the value of these PCOs. The difference between these is they were contract driven. The contract that was signed with the design build team is explicit in terms of the terms. And because of the delays, there were real costs that were claimed by the design build team, specifically with PCO 39. for the NTP delay. They did have staff that were sitting and working and continuing to work on the project, but weren't being fully utilized because they were construction-related staff that were mobilized and couldn't be used for construction activities. And I don't want to get into too much detail in the interest of time here, but again, that was a contractor-driven change in PCO 39, and PCO 59 is very similar in terms of the escalation calculations. Now, if the escalation doesn't manifest itself, again, this is escalation that's tagged on to the end of the project based on the contract language and how the contract's written. And this was vetted with the city attorney initially, and the PCOs were also reviewed by the city attorney. And that escalation cost, if it doesn't manifest and the design build team does not spend that cost, then that's cost that the city does not have to pay. But again, the contract terms in the design build agreement dictated that change order. So again, I think that's how you can kind of fundamentally separate these two PCOs that were considered as part of amendment number 3 back in May with the current delay PCO that we're talking about that we were able to avoid in that the city paid roughly $500,000. $300,000 of that cost was offset, but that $500,000 was well spent because it was the way that it was done and the collaborative nature that we worked with the design build team. We were able to mitigate a significant delay that we could have faced. So that's the way that I would ask you to kind of look at the difference between those 3 different PCOs.
Okay, well, thank you for the explanation. I just think, though, in response to that perhaps a new terminology would be more transparent to particularly the people and city and ratepayers of Morro Bay, that instead of calling some of these things cost overruns, call them, like you said, offsets or contract, inflations of total price, because they're not really costs, they're just sort of accounting categories being shifted around a bit in some of these cases. And even for example, this environmental, forget what you called it, the environmental allowance, it sort of hides the fact that we're actually paying $500,000 for PCO number 71, when on this city report it's half that amount. And so it just for transparency and to all the stakeholders involved, it might be better to not to watch the terminology when we're talking about costs and call things for what they really are in terms of offsets or delayed inflations, whatever terms you might come up with. But it's just hard to see where costs fall in some of this sort of accounting gerrymandering, if you will. So that's all I'd say, right?
I just want to emphasize something that Eric talked about a few minutes ago is if we get to the end of the contract and the contractor hasn't incurred those costs, we won't pay them. The way this contract is written, it's a guaranteed maximum price contract where the contractor has an open book. We review all of their costs and pay their costs plus the negotiated overhead and profit. So we may have a guaranteed maximum, and I'm just going to make up numbers here, a guaranteed maximum price of $75 million project. We may only spend $73 million of that the contractor has showed us what the actual costs are, but it will never exceed the guaranteed maximum price without a authorized change order.
Okay. Yep.
All right. Thank you, Tori and Rob and Eric.
Thank you.
The only question I have, and it's just for clarification purposes, is the 614,000 contingency that's remaining. That's strictly for the water reclamation facility. That does not include contingency for the conveyance system. Is that right? Conveyance system has its own contingency?
Correct. Conveyance system has its own contingency as well as a separate contingency for the injection wells.
Okay. I know there had been some people that commented that, oh, we haven't even got into the conveyance system yet, so we're almost out of money there. So, okay, I just wanted to make that clear. Are there any last minute comments from any other? We've gone through the board. Any other board member want to come back? It looks like Jan has something there.
How much, I guess this might be for Rob, what is the size of how much property was purchased for this?
We purchased about 27 acres up there, so the vast majority of the site will be undeveloped, and then the developable area is down near the bottom.
Okay, and then when we're talking about this fence for the red-legged frog, does that just go around the footprint of the facility, or is that for the entire property?
It's the footprint plus a little bit that the red-legged frog exclusion fence will be in. And, the changes that we're looking at are changing from a concrete wall to a more high-density polyethylene or plastic type fence rather than concrete. I don't see the frogs getting through the plastic fence, and concrete seems a bit overkill to protect ourselves from the frogs.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other board members have a final question? Okay, no action is required by the board besides providing our input, which we have, and hopefully.
I'd like to have, as part of our input, that the table and discussions of the negotiations be expanded, so you can see what you call it, so they can see the
rationale,
draft PCO, the original estimate, whether Carollo thought those costs were reasonable. Jeff Heller's suggestion that you have owner or agency or contractor generated being annotated to the table. And then the rationale be expanded, so we'll provide a rationale for each change order, so you can look at it and say, yeah, this is the reason why we did it. And so it stands by itself rather than requiring a board presentation to explain it.
Thank you, John. Those are good points to be made. Hopefully the City Council will have a more clear picture in their packet before they get to the meeting. Any other last comments from the board? Thank you, Eric and Rob and all of staff that have participated this evening. That will finish this item. And let's see. That's the last item on the agenda. Just one final reminder, and Scott, what is the final closing date for applications for board positions? I'd like to mention that we still, mention again that there will be 5 potential vacancies available to the public to apply. So what's the last date for applications?
I'm going to have to look on the website if you don't mind.
Oh, that's okay. I'm sure Rob knows.
Yeah, Joe probably knows off the top.
Yeah, it's actually December 31st, so the end of this year.
Okay, December 31st. So there's still a month and a half to go for people to submit their applications. Just go to the city website or drop something off at City Hall to put in your applications, either for resubmitting if you're currently a board member whose term expires, or a new member of the public that would like to participate. So with that, I will again thank everybody and thank AGP for conducting this. And Tori, are you waving?
I am waving, Mr. Chairman. I do have one more item. It's the Bartle Wells latest financial plan and rate analysis. It was mentioned back in May, but I'm not able to find it on the city website. And the original 2018 report is the only one I can find on the city website. So I'd like to see the updated Bartle James rate study as these cost PCOs are coming in. And it was mentioned by Jen Calloway back in June that we were promised a re-examination of rates that may in fact go lower given the WIFIA loan, the low interest rates, and so on and so forth. And so there was a review by Bartles and James to see whether or not those reductions could come in, given the cheaper money that we have to pay for the facility. And so I've been kind of waiting for that study to be public, but it doesn't seem to be public.
And that study is not complete yet. Until we have the state revolving fund locked in and know what the rate is and know how much money they're providing in loan and grant and how much cash on hand would be needed, and also have the pipeline conveyance contract reviewed and approved, we really can't give that final analysis. And that's what we told council, I think last month, when we gave an update on this. So we will be bringing that forward after we have a better idea of SRF. And I think Eric can probably cover this a bit better than me, but we're thinking that process will be complete early next year. We are recommended and required to go to the Citizen Finance Advisory Committee to present that, since they're looking at the financial side of the house, and then City Council will review. But Bartle and Well will provide the analysis once we have those key pieces of information. So this time it's too early to tell where we'll line up, other than to know that they did do a stress test on our rates, and we have plenty of capacity to handle the PCOs, as well as the pipeline conveyance contract that will be reviewed by council tomorrow without having to raise rates.
Okay. Any other last comments there before we adjourn? Jan?
Scott, we're going ahead with this. We're going to get the WIFIA and the state revolving fund, and every time that I'm in a conversation, this comes up, you're saying that the state revolving fund hasn't been secured. I mean, hopefully, obviously, you're making us feel like you're confident it's going to be.
Yeah, 100%. We just have to go through a very lengthy process. WIFIA took over 2 years to come from beginning to end. SRF will be a little easier because we did a lot of the work that will just transfer, mainly around the environmental. We couldn't move forward with the project. We couldn't start the project until SRF signed off on the environmental. So we're going to get it. It's just a matter of time. Their process was slowed significantly because they're all working from home, all of them. So they're way behind. So we would have figured by now we'd already have it locked in. So it's just one of the things of a global pandemic you got to deal with. So we're 100% confident we're getting it. It's just the particulars of it haven't been settled yet. They're looking at the legal side of it right now. That's where we were with you last year, and it took a couple months to go through that process. But again, a lot of the legwork was already completed by WIFIA. WIFIA and SRF staff have coordinated significantly on the reviews. So we got a leg up on that. It's just taking longer because they're working from home.
Well, good. Hate to get to the end of this and have them say, sorry.
Right. Yeah. No, the board approved up to $105 million. So we're not worried about the funding. It's just getting down to the precision on what the rate is and how much.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, again, thank you everyone, and until our sometime in the future next surprise meeting, this meeting is now adjourned.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks all.
Exactly.